Sarah had always dreamed of living in a quiet suburban neighborhood. After years of renting in busy city apartments, she finally found her perfect home, a modest two-story house tucked at the end of a cul-de-sac. It was everything she had imagined, peaceful, safe, and secluded. She was eager to settle in and make the place her own. At first, the neighbors seemed friendly, though a bit distant. One particular neighbor, Mr. Edwards, caught her attention. He was an older man who lived alone, rarely seen outside his home, and always watching from behind his front window. His eyes seemed to follow Sarah whenever she walked past his house, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he was always looking at her, whether she was walking to her car or coming home from work. At first, Sarah didn't think much of it. Perhaps it was just the loneliness of old age. But then things began to feel off. It started with small things. One evening, Sarah returned home from work to find her front door slightly ajar. It wasn't wide open, just a crack, as if someone had pushed it open and then quickly stepped away. She immediately felt a surge of panic. She didn't remember leaving the door unlocked, and there were no signs of forced entry. Still, she assumed it was just a mistake on her part. She checked everything inside. The lights were on. Her things were in place. There was no sign of a break-in. But then the feeling of unease wouldn't leave. A few days later, Sarah came home to find that her mail had been tampered with. It was all there, her bills, junk mail, a package. But someone had gone through it, rearranging it as if searching for something. When she questioned the postman, he looked at her strangely. "I didn't see anyone near your mailbox," he said. Her thoughts immediately went to Mr. Edwards. Perhaps he was just a nosy neighbor. Perhaps he had been wandering around her yard, maybe even going into her house when she wasn't there. But why? And how? The next few days were uneventful, but Sarah couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't until one night, a few weeks later, that things escalated. Sarah woke up in the middle of the night, her heart racing. A strange noise had pulled her from her sleep. It was the faint sound of footsteps, soft, slow, and steady, coming from downstairs. Her breath caught in her throat. No one should be in her house. The locks were all secure, and there was no way someone could have gotten in. But the sound didn't stop. It was as if whoever was downstairs was pacing, walking back and forth in her living room. Paralyzed with fear, Sarah lay still in her bed, barely breathing, trying to listen. The footsteps stopped. Then she heard something worse, a soft, slow tap on her bedroom door. It was so quiet, it could have been the wind or an overactive imagination, but it was too deliberate to ignore. Her mind raced. Had someone broken in? Was it Mr. Edwards? Suddenly, the door creaked open just enough to cast a sliver of light across the room. Sarah held her breath. It was quiet again. Too quiet. She waited for what felt like an eternity, heart hammering in her chest. The light from the hall flickered, and she heard the unmistakable sound of breathing. It wasn't her own. It was close, so close it was almost as if someone was standing right next to her. Finally, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She screamed, throwing herself out of bed, and rushed toward the hallway. But as she turned the corner, there was nothing. Just the empty hallway, eerily silent. No one was there. Her hands shaking, Sarah called the police. The officers arrived quickly and searched the house, but they found no signs of an intruder. No footprints, no broken windows, no signs of forced entry. The only thing they could tell her was that her home was secure, and they suggested she install security cameras. But Sarah knew in her gut that something was wrong. Something had been happening to her that couldn't be explained. The next day, Sarah decided to call in a locksmith to change all of her locks. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside her house, and the thought that it could have been Mr. Edwards, the quiet, mysterious neighbor who always watched from his window, sent chills down her spine. The locksmith arrived and began working on the door locks. But when he opened the door to the basement, he froze. There was something odd in the corner of the basement. Small, indistinct items piled high in the darkness. As he turned on the light, Sarah gasped. In the far corner of the basement was a stack of her personal belongings. The items weren't just her things. Some were things she hadn't noticed missing, items she hadn't even realized she had forgotten about. There were books, photos, and even clothes. And in the middle of it all was a single old-fashioned notebook with her name written on the front. Opening it, Sarah flipped through the pages, each one more disturbing than the last. The notebook contained detailed notes about her life, times she had gone to work, what she had eaten for dinner, even the exact times she had walked past Mr. Edwards' house. It was as if he had been following her every move. Her blood ran cold as she read the final entry. "I know you'll come looking for me soon. I'll be waiting in the place where I first saw you. Don't try to leave." Terrified, Sarah immediately called the police again, but this time, when they checked Mr. Edwards' house, they found it abandoned. The police discovered that Mr. Edwards had died months before Sarah had even moved in. The house had been sold after his death, and no one had bothered to check on it. The most chilling revelation, however, came when they checked the basement. Mr. Edwards had been living in the house the entire time, secretly watching Sarah and her every move. He had been hiding in the very same basement where she had found the creepy notebook, coming in and out unnoticed. The worst part? No one ever figured out how Mr. Edwards had been able to stay hidden for so long, especially since he had been dead for months before Sarah even moved in. It was as if his spirit had never left, watching and waiting for the right moment to make his presence known. To this day, Sarah can't forget the feeling of being watched by a man who was supposed to be long gone. She moved out of the house soon after, but she always wonders if Mr. Edwards is still out there. John and Emily had always dreamed of living in a quiet, picturesque town. When they found the perfect house, an old Victorian-style home on the outskirts of town, they jumped at the opportunity. The house was spacious, with sprawling gardens, a small white picket fence, and a sense of charm that seemed to fit their ideal of peace and serenity. They couldn't wait to begin their new life there. Their neighbors, however, were a different story. Mrs. Gibbons lived in the house next door. She was an elderly woman with sharp, piercing eyes and an unsettling presence. She rarely left her home, except for occasional trips to the grocery store. At first, John and Emily thought nothing of it. Every neighborhood has its quirky residents, and Mrs. Gibbons seemed harmless enough, at least outwardly. But as the days passed, they began to notice something strange. Mrs. Gibbons had an odd habit of appearing at their windows always at dusk, watching them with an intensity that sent chills down their spines. Whenever they glanced out, they'd catch her staring from behind her curtains, her face nearly pressed to the glass, as if waiting for them to notice. They tried to brush it off as mere curiosity, but it felt more like something sinister. The real oddities began one evening when Emily stayed home alone while John worked late. She had just finished dinner and was reading in the living room when she heard a soft whisper. She froze, unsure if she had imagined it. The whisper grew louder, more distinct, but it wasn't coming from the TV or the radio. It seemed to be coming from outside, almost as if someone was speaking through the walls. "Emily. Emily." Her name echoed in the silence. Emily's heart raced as she looked around, feeling suddenly very small in the vast, darkening room. She stood up, cautiously walking to the window and peering outside. Her eyes scanned the front yard and the street beyond. Nothing was there. Confused and frightened, Emily decided to let it go, thinking it might have been the wind or her imagination playing tricks on her. But that night, when she went to bed, the whispers returned. "Emily, come closer." The voice was now clearer, more urgent, and it seemed to come from directly outside her window. Panic set in as she rushed to the curtain and pulled it open, but there was no one there. Just the dark expanse of the backyard and the ever-present glow of Mrs. Gibbons's house next door. Still, Emily felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as though someone was watching her every move. The whispers continued every night after that, growing louder and more insistent. "Emily, you're not alone. They're here." At first, Emily thought she was losing her mind, but when she mentioned the whispers to John, he became concerned, insisting that she had just been hearing things. But Emily was sure. It wasn't just in her head. It was real. One afternoon, Emily decided to confront Mrs. Gibbons. She had to know what was going on, why the old woman seemed to watch her so intently, and if she had anything to do with the mysterious whispers. When she knocked on Mrs. Gibbons's door, the old woman answered with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hello, dear. How can I help you?" Mrs. Gibbons asked, her voice sweet but cold. Emily hesitated, her mind racing. She wanted to ask about the whispers, but wasn't sure how to approach it. "I've been hearing some strange sounds at night," she began, trying to sound casual. "I was wondering if you might know what they are." Mrs. Gibbons's smile faltered for a moment. Then she leaned in closer and whispered, "You can hear them, can't you? The whispers. They've chosen you." Emily recoiled slightly, her heart pounding in her chest. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The voices of those who were lost," Mrs. Gibbons replied, her voice growing more intense. "They are in the house. They want to speak to you. They've always wanted to, but no one would listen." Her eyes flickered with something that wasn't quite human. "Now, they have chosen you, Emily." Emily backed away from the door, feeling her blood run cold. She didn't know whether to be terrified or to laugh. "You're insane," she muttered, turning and quickly walking away from the house. But her thoughts kept racing. What was Mrs. Gibbons talking about? How did she know her name? And who were these voices? That night, the whispers grew louder than ever. "Emily, we're here. We're waiting." This time, it was no longer just her name. The voices spoke in a language she didn't understand, one filled with urgency, begging her to come closer. She couldn't take it anymore. Terrified, she grabbed her phone and dialed John's number, but when he answered, his voice sounded distant, almost muffled. "Emily, they want you to come. You can't ignore them." Confused, Emily tried to explain what was happening, but before she could say anything more, the call abruptly ended. The phone line went silent. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The air grew cold, and a strange, oppressive feeling settled over the house. Emily felt a presence behind her, and before she could react, a shadowy figure appeared in the doorway. The figure was tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to burn into her soul. "Emily!" She screamed and stumbled backward, but the figure stepped forward, its presence suffocating her. She couldn't breathe. The figure reached out a long, bony hand, and just as it touched her skin, Emily was struck with an overwhelming vision, a flood of images from the past. She saw the house, old and decrepit, filled with whispering voices. She saw dark figures moving through the halls, their faces twisted in agony. The figure, now fully visible as Mrs. Gibbons, appeared beside her, her eyes filled with a strange satisfaction. "They have found you," Mrs. Gibbons whispered, her voice cold and final. Emily awoke the next morning in her bed, unsure of what had happened. Was it a dream? The whispers had stopped, and the house seemed quiet once again. But Emily knew better. The house was not empty, and Mrs. Gibbons had been right. The voices had chosen her, and they were still here, in the walls, in the floorboards, just waiting to be heard again. The next day, Emily and John packed their bags. They couldn't stay in that house any longer, not after what she had experienced. But as they left, Emily glanced one last time at Mrs. Gibbons's house. The old woman stood at the window, watching them leave, and as their car pulled away, Emily could still hear the faintest whisper on the wind. "Emily, we're still waiting." When Michael and his family moved into their new house, they thought they had found the perfect place to settle down. The house was a charming 2-story with ivy climbing up the walls and a sprawling backyard surrounded by trees. It was located in a quiet neighborhood, just on the outskirts of town, and the peaceful atmosphere felt like the perfect escape from the hustle and bustle of the city. However, there was one feature about the house that bothered Michael from the start: the basement door. It wasn't so much the door itself that unsettled him. It was the fact that it was locked. Michael had done a quick tour of the house before they moved in, and while everything else seemed to be in order, the basement door was noticeably closed and secured with an old, rusty padlock. When he asked the real estate agent about it, she simply shrugged and said, "We're not sure why it's locked. The previous owners didn't mention it." Michael was curious but didn't think much more about it. He had other things to focus on: unpacking, settling into their new life, and getting used to the house. Yet, every time he walked past that basement door, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was hidden behind it. The door, with its chipped paint and faded brass handle, seemed out of place in an otherwise well-kept house. It was as if it was keeping something contained. Weeks passed, and the family got more comfortable in their new home. But one night, as Michael was heading down the hallway to the kitchen, he heard a sound. It came from the basement, the faintest scratching noise. It was almost imperceptible at first, but as he stood still, listening, it became louder. The sound of nails dragging against wood, like someone, or something, was trying to get out. Michael's heart began to race. He told himself it was just the house settling, the usual creaks and groans of an old home. But the noise was distinct, unnerving. It was unlike anything he had ever heard before. The next day, curiosity got the better of him. Michael decided he had to know what was behind that basement door. He went down to the local hardware store, bought a set of bolt cutters, and returned home, determined to open the door once and for all. As he stood before the locked door, the air felt thick, heavy. He could almost feel the tension in the walls, as if the house itself was holding its breath. With a swift motion, he cut through the rusted padlock. The lock fell to the floor with a dull clang, and Michael slowly opened the door. The basement was cold and dim, lit only by a faint bulb that flickered above. Michael hesitated for a moment, but his curiosity pushed him down the stairs. The smell of mildew and dust hit him immediately, but it was the sight that caught his attention. The basement was unlike any ordinary storage space. There were no shelves or old furniture stacked in corners. Instead, the room was completely empty, except for a single chair placed in the center of the floor. Its wood was worn, as though it had been used for years. And that's when Michael noticed something else. On the floor surrounding the chair were deep, dark stains that looked like dried blood. Suddenly, he heard a faint rustling from behind him, like someone was moving around in the shadows. He spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just the still, silent air of the basement. As he turned back to the chair, Michael noticed something new, a series of strange markings on the walls, as though someone had scratched something into the plaster. They were crude and uneven, like they had been made in desperation. The symbols seemed to be some sort of pattern, but Michael couldn't make sense of them. The longer he stood there, the more he felt a presence in the room with him. It wasn't a person, but something far older, something far more sinister. He couldn't explain it, but the air in the basement felt suffocating, heavy with the weight of forgotten memories. Suddenly, Michael heard footsteps coming from upstairs. It was his wife, Sarah, calling to him, asking if everything was all right. Michael hesitated for a moment, torn between his need to explore further and the growing sense of dread that gnawed at him. He decided to leave for now, to return to the basement another time when he felt stronger. But as he made his way up the stairs, the door to the basement slammed shut behind him. The sound was so forceful that it made the whole house shake. Michael turned around in a panic, but the door was locked again, just as it had been before. He could hear something on the other side. Something was trying to get out. Michael's unease grew. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen in the house. At night, he would wake up to the sound of muffled footsteps coming from the basement. He would hear whispers, faint voices speaking in a language he didn't recognize. And the air around the basement door always felt unnaturally cold. One evening, Sarah came to him with a concerned look on her face. "Michael," she said, her voice trembling. "I've been hearing things." From the basement, footsteps, whispering. "It's like someone's down there." Michael didn't want to scare her, but he knew something had to be done. That night, he decided to go back into the basement, this time prepared to uncover whatever dark secret lay hidden behind the locked door. When he opened the door, he was shocked to find the basement had changed. The chair was gone, but the walls were now covered in the same strange markings he had noticed before. And on the floor, in the center of the room, was a large, deep hole, dark and wide, as if something had been dug there, but never filled. As he stared into the hole, Michael heard the whispers again, louder, more urgent this time. "Michael, come closer." Frozen in place, Michael could feel the air growing colder around him. Something was reaching out to him from that hole, pulling at his very soul. He took a step forward, compelled by an unseen force. Suddenly, he felt a hand, ice cold, grip his wrist. It yanked him forward, dragging him toward the hole, toward whatever was waiting inside. Panic surged through him, and he fought back with all his strength. But the grip only tightened, pulling him closer. Desperate, Michael screamed for Sarah, for help. But his voice was drowned out by the deafening whispers, the voices of those who had been trapped in the house long before him. He could feel them, touching him, pulling him toward the darkness. With one final desperate effort, Michael wrenched himself free. He ran up the stairs, slammed the basement door shut, and bolted it with everything he had. But the whispers followed him, echoing through the house. A constant reminder that whatever was in that basement, whatever had been waiting all these years, was not finished. He and his family moved out the next day. The house was sold again, and the new owners never asked about the basement. But Michael knew the truth. The basement was never meant to be opened. Some doors, some secrets, were never meant to be discovered. And whatever was lurking in the darkness beneath that house would always be waiting for someone else to let it out. If you've made it this far, you're clearly a fan of horror. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe so we can keep delivering more dark tales that keep you up at night. It was a cold winter night when Sarah moved into the old house on Maple Street. The house had been on the market for months, and she had finally managed to strike a deal with the sellers. It was an aging Victorian-style home, a little worn down but full of charm and potential. The moment Sarah stepped inside, she could feel the history in the walls, layers of old wallpaper, creaking wooden floors, and high, dusty ceilings. It felt like the perfect place to start over. After the chaos of a recent breakup and a move to a new town, Sarah was looking for peace and privacy. The house's secluded location, at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, seemed ideal. She'd have her own space, away from the noise and distractions of city life. The house itself was surrounded by tall, thick trees that made it feel almost like a fortress, safe and distant from the outside world. But the very first night, Sarah felt something wasn't right. It started with subtle things, small noises in the walls, like scratching or tapping, that would echo through the house when the lights were off. At first, Sarah tried to convince herself that it was just the house settling, the sound of old wood adjusting to the cold winter air. But the noises continued, growing louder with each passing day. It wasn't just the walls anymore. It felt like footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the upstairs hallway when she was downstairs. One evening, while Sarah was unpacking in the living room, she thought she saw a shadow flicker past the window. Her heart skipped a beat as she rushed to the window, peeking outside into the darkness. Nothing. No one was there. But that was the first time she started to feel watched. The unsettling feeling continued to grow. When Sarah would go to bed, she would leave the door slightly ajar, just enough to let the hallway light filter into her room. But each morning, the door would be wide open, as though someone had been standing there all night, staring into her room. Then came the whispering. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. Late at night, Sarah would hear the faintest of voices calling her name. Soft, almost breathy. She would sit up in bed, her heart pounding, straining to hear. The voices would fade before she could make out the words, but the sensation of being watched never left. She started to lock the door at night, but even then, she could still feel the presence outside her room. One night, Sarah decided to confront the fear that had been growing inside her. She armed herself with a flashlight and crept through the house, determined to figure out what was going on. The silence of the house was deafening as she moved through each room, checking every closet, every corner. When she reached the staircase, the air grew colder, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The flashlight beam flickered as she ascended the stairs, and when she reached the top, she froze. At the far end of the hallway, she saw it, a figure standing motionless in the dark. A tall, thin figure, too still to be human. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure didn't move, didn't even acknowledge her presence. It simply stood there, facing away from her, just out of reach of the light. Her pulse raced as she took a cautious step forward, but as she did, the figure slowly turned toward her, its face hidden in the shadows. Before she could react, the figure vanished, as if it had melted into the darkness. The flashlight flickered and went out completely. Panic surged through her. She dropped the flashlight, her hands trembling as she rushed back down the stairs, heart pounding in her ears. When she reached the bottom, she found the front door wide open, swinging gently in the wind. She had no memory of opening it. The whispers followed her throughout the next few days, louder and more insistent. Her once peaceful sanctuary had turned into a house of terror. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was waiting for her to notice it. Sarah reached out to a neighbor, a friendly woman named Carol who lived 2 houses down, and explained what had been happening. Carol listened sympathetically, but also seemed strangely reserved when Sarah mentioned the figure she had seen on the stairs. "You're not the first person to notice something like that in that house," Carol said quietly. "There's an old story about the place, something that's been passed around for years. The last owners left suddenly, and no one really knows why. But there were rumors of strange occurrences, things going missing, the feeling of being watched, and sometimes those whispers." "What do you mean, whispers?" Sarah asked, a chill running down her spine. Carol hesitated, looking over her shoulder before speaking. "They say the house has a history. A long time ago, a man lived there. An older man who was a bit off. He never really talked to anyone, but he always watched the people who came and went. They say he died in the house, and that's when things started to change. People who lived there after him claimed to hear footsteps when no one was around, whispers in the night, and that figure you saw, standing at the top of the stairs, they say it's him, still watching, still waiting." Sarah felt a knot form in her stomach. She had to know more, and Carol seemed to be hiding something. "What happened to him? What do you mean, still waiting?" Carol's voice dropped to a near whisper. "They say he never left, that he still haunts the house, watching the people who live there. Some believe he's waiting for someone to come to him, to join him in the house." The words hung in the air like a dark cloud, and Sarah could feel the weight of them pressing on her chest. That night, Sarah could no longer deny it. The presence in the house had become too real to ignore. The whispers were no longer just sounds. They were words, clear and unmistakable. "Sarah, come closer." Her blood ran cold as she stood in the middle of her room, unable to move. The whispers surrounded her, echoing through every corner of the house, as though 100 voices were speaking at once, all calling her name. She knew she wasn't alone, and the realization made her want to scream. but the voice in her ear was too close now, too real. "Sarah, I've been waiting." She spun around to see the figure, not in the shadows, but standing at the edge of her bed, its face still hidden. It reached out toward her, and she stumbled back, her legs giving way beneath her. The figure took another step closer, and Sarah felt a cold breath brush against her skin. She couldn't run. She was frozen. Suddenly, the figure stepped into the light, and Sarah saw its face. It was a man, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through her very soul. His lips curled into a smile, but there was no warmth in it, only an emptiness that chilled her to the bone. "Come with me," he whispered, his voice low and beckoning. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as though 1,000 voices were pleading with her. She could feel herself being pulled toward the figure, her body moving against her will. With one final burst of strength, Sarah screamed, forcing herself to move. She ran toward the door, out of her room, down the stairs, and into the cold night air. She didn't stop until she was at Carol's house, breathless and shaking, her heart racing in terror. Sarah never returned to the house on Maple Street. The next morning, she called the real estate agent and demanded to speak with the owners. But when the agent checked, they learned that the house had been sold several times over the years, each owner leaving abruptly without explanation. No one had ever stayed for long. To this day, the house remains empty, its door left ajar in a silent invitation, waiting for someone else to hear the whispers. And those who pass by say they still hear them, faintly, in the wind. "Come closer,"